Hello and welcome to my channel, where I'll be telling you all kinds of strange stories ranging from true crime to some much less believable, although just as fascinating, tales. For today's video we have the mysterious death of Joshua Maddux. Listen in and see what you think. Joshua Josh Maddux was born on the 9th of March 1990 in Woodland Park, Colorado, a community of about 8,000 people in the Pike National Forest in Teller County. Josh lived with his father, Mike, and two sisters, Kate and Ruth, after his parents split. He had long blonde hair, was 6 feet tall, and he had a carefree outlook on life. He enjoyed music, spending most of his spare time composing songs or playing the guitar. The only negative in Josh's life was that Zachary, his elder brother, was the victim of suicide in 2006. Despite suffering from depression due to this, Josh had been doing well in the years leading up to whatever it was that happened to him in 2008. Josh left home on the 8th of May 2008 to go for a hike. He often went hiking alone, so no one thought much of it. However, when he did not return later that evening, the family grew concerned. Josh's father, Mike, reported him missing to the police on the 13th of May, 5 days after he vanished. Authorities, as well as friends and relatives, searched the neighbourhood and adjacent areas where Josh may have gone for a stroll. Nothing was found after months of searching, and hopes had gone. It was Josh's sister who thought maybe he'd left town to go and perform music or start a new life, and that was the only lead anybody had. The police agreed with this idea. They had no cause to suspect foul play, so he remained a missing person, and that was that, for years. In 2015, Chuck Murphy, an 80-year-old builder from Colorado Springs, began demolishing his old wood cottage on Meadowlark Lane, which was bordered by towering trees. Chuck had first bought the cottage in the 1950s, but the cabin hadn't been used in over a decade now and had fallen into ruin. Chuck took the decision to demolish the cabin to make room for property development, and work began in August 2015. When Chuck arrived at the cottage on the 7th of August, there was a distinct animal smell all around. Only it wasn't actually animals. Chuck made the horrifying discovery of a young man's corpse curled into a fetal position with his knees over his head when the workmen used an excavator to demolish one of the 2 chimneys in the cottage. Chuck immediately contacted the police, who came with the county coroner, and who subsequently positively confirmed the corpse as that of the missing man, Joshua Maddux, using dental records. The news that Josh's body had been found stunned the Maddux family, who simply could not believe it. It made no sense to them. They had expected him to be somewhere far away, travelling, living in another country, having another life, but in reality, he was really quite near all the time. The only thing anyone can surmise is that he had been exploring the cottage, which had been abandoned for a long time, when a terrible tragedy occurred. The truly devastating thing was, apart from Josh's death of course, was that the cabin he was found in was just 2 streets away from the Maddux family home. But the hunt for Josh had passed it by. There had been no indication of life, and there was no need to inspect the chimney. Why would there be? Chuck Murphy, the cabin owner, had seldom visited, but on the times when he had come to check in, he'd not seen anything out of the ordinary about the property at all. Horribly, because the cabin was located in the centre of a vast piece of ground surrounded by thick pines about 50 feet from the road, police believed that if Josh had screamed for help, no one would have been able to hear him. Al Bourne, the coroner for Teller County, conducted an examination and discovered no trace of narcotics in Josh's bones. Neither were there any indications of trauma. There were no shattered bones, no knife marks, no gunshot holes, but there were a lot of questions without any answers. All anyone knew was that he hadn't died as soon as he entered the chimney. It was probably either dehydration or hypothermia, both of which will take days to kill you. Bourne issued an accidental death judgment on the 28th of September 2015. Josh, he reasoned, had gone into the chimney and gotten trapped in the bricks. Bourne determined that hypothermia was the most probable cause of death, since the temperature had fallen to the mid-20s, -6 degrees or so, around the time of his disappearance between May the 8th and 10th, 2008. Many people, including his family, had concerns over the coroner's findings about what had happened to Josh. Chuck questioned the findings of accidental death since the chimney had been constructed 20 years earlier and was equipped with a strong wire mesh hanging from steel hooks to prevent animals and general outside debris from getting trapped within the chimney or entering the cabin itself. Bourne speculated that the grate might have been rusty or broken in some way, adding, "Nobody noticed the metal mesh and we didn't see it in any of our pictures. It must have gone." Murphy replied that during the demolition all metalwork was gathered and removed for scrap, which would explain why the coroner was unable to identify the mesh, since it was not there. It wasn't near the chimney, it had been moved. With all this in mind, Bourne revisited the case 3 days after his original finding. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something was off. The mesh was not the only thing that cast doubt on the initial autopsy. A big wooden breakfast bar that had been ripped from a kitchen wall and moved across the room to obstruct the chimney from inside the cabin prompted further questions. If the breakfast bar had been ripped from the wall, who did it and why? Josh's corpse was discovered in a fetal position with his legs over his head. He would have had to enter the chimney head first in order to get into such a position. This was uncommon. Who would go into a deep hole like a chimney or anything else head first without knowing what was there? And Bourne had previously said he believed it would have required 2 people to place him in the chimney in such a way. What was even more odd was that when Josh's corpse was discovered, he was just wearing a thin thermal shirt and his clothing was found inside the cabin, folded up next to the fireplace. No one knows why he removed his clothing, shoes and socks, and why he then walked outside, climbed up onto the roof, and went headfirst down the chimney, which is what the evidence was telling them must have happened. Unless, of course, Josh was not alone. The autopsy report was quickly amended, and once it was, it stated that the cause of death was accidental death, homicide, or reasons unknown. Once the news broke, the authorities got numerous anonymous tips proposing leads and identifying individuals who boasted about murdering Josh. One such person was, by 2015, imprisoned in a Texas jail after previously serving time in Seattle and Portland for violent crimes. The police had received a report that this man had been spotted with Josh, although exact dates were never established. A post on Reddit in 2015 also named this particular suspect. It said, I went to high school with this thin, nerdy hippie guy called Andy who played guitar in a band. I was never close to him, but after a year or so, I graduated and one of my best friends, Josh, began hanging out with him, and then he went missing. Andy had actually gone down to New Mexico by that time, where he found himself talking to the caregiver of a handicapped man and was asked over to their apartment. Caretaker goes into the shower. When he comes out, the handicapped man has been stabbed to death and Andy has vanished. When Andy was apprehended, he stated that he murdered a lady in Taos and put her body in a barrel. And the police did discover a lady stuffed in a barrel near Taos. But they'd already got someone in jail for that and chose to stick with their original guy. Years later, investigators discovered that the caretaker had died in a bar brawl, and without him, the police didn't have much in the way of evidence, so Andy's case was dismissed there too. Several of us went to the police and said, "Yo, Josh, who went missing, was last seen with Andy, who is a murderer. Maybe you should look into that?" Despite a fair bit of nagging, nothing came of it, and by nothing, I mean the police generally didn't answer our calls, and once mistakenly revoked the bulletin on Josh because they said he's alive and well and living in the next town over. He wasn't. He was in the chimney of an abandoned cabin about 2 blocks away from his parents' house. The body had been there for around 7 years, according to the coroner, who ruled the death accidental, finding that Josh had probably climbed down the chimney in an effort to get into the house and become trapped. Maybe that makes sense. Except that, in addition to Josh having last been spotted with Andy immediately before his stabbing spree, others phoned in to say they had heard Andy was boasting about having placed Josh in a hole. Someone had pulled a hefty bar from the kitchen wall and placed it up against the fireplace. Plus, no one can account for the fact that Josh's belongings were already inside the cabin, implying that A, he'd already broken in and would have had to lock himself out before going for the chimney, and B, he might have noticed that either the mesh or the kitchen bar would have prevented him entering through the fireplace. Or the fact that when he was discovered, Josh's legs were above his head, meaning that he would have had to plunge in head first. Andrew Richard Newman was Andy's full name. He was arrested in New Mexico on suspicion of a deadly stabbing and is now serving his term in prison. Apart from this Reddit post, there are other ideas. The cabin's owner, Chuck Murphy, said, "It's a genuine dilemma. It's a sad, horrible tale. I just know he didn't go down that chimney by himself." The situation is strange and confusing, and several questions do come to mind. The rebar or mesh in the chimney would have prohibited anybody from entering unless it had been removed prior to destruction or had rusted away as indicated by the coroner. So what did happen to it? Why would Josh take off his clothes and put them by the hearth along with his boots? Why was the breakfast bar moved to block the entrance to the cabin's fireplace? We'll probably never know what really happened to Josh Maddux. What we can be sure of was that, whether accidental or intentional, it would have been a horrible way to go. Thank you so much for watching my video. If you enjoyed the content, click the subscribe and like button so you can receive more content like this strange story every week. See you next time.